Picture this. It's a Saturday morning in 1955. The sun is barely up. A young woman in a cotton dress steps out onto her front porch, a cup of coffee in her hand, her hair done up like she's already expecting company. She waves at the neighbor across the street without thinking about it. He waves back. 2 doors down, a screen door slams. Kids spill out onto the sidewalk. Someone's mother leans out a window and calls a name. A lawnmower starts up somewhere at the end of the block. Nobody planned any of this. Nobody put it on a calendar. Nobody sent a reminder. It simply was, the way it had always been, the way it would be again tomorrow and the day after that. In every neighborhood, on every block, in every corner of this country, from the rocky coast of Maine to the sun-baked streets of California, from the edges of big cities to the heart of farm country. Because back then, people lived by a code. It was never written down.
There were no fines for breaking it, no committee to enforce it, but everyone knew it. Every single person on that street carried it inside them, the way you carry the sound of your mother's voice, without thinking, without trying, simply because it had always been there. That code was the invisible thread that held a neighborhood together. You never noticed it until it was gone. And once it was gone, nothing was quite the same. Today we're counting down 25 of those unwritten rules. Some of them will make you nod, some will make you laugh, and a few, especially the ones near the top of the list, are going to make you feel something that's hard to name. Something like loss, something like longing, something like the memory of a place you can never quite get back to, no matter how hard you try. Stay with me all the way to number 1, because number 1 is the rule that made all the others possible, and it's the one we've lost most completely. Before we get into the list, if you grew up in a neighborhood like this one, or if someone you love did, do me a favor and hit subscribe. We put out a new piece of American memory every single week, and I'd hate for you to miss one. And if this takes you back, leave a comment. Tell me where you grew up. Tell me what your neighborhood was like. Those comments are the best part of what we do here, and I read every single one. Now, 25 rules. Let's go back to 1955. We'll start with the simplest one, the one that cost nothing and meant everything. In 1955, if a car drove down your street, you waved. It didn't matter if you knew them. It didn't matter if you'd had a disagreement last week. It didn't matter if you were in the middle of something. You looked up, made eye contact, and you raised your hand. And they waved back. That wave said, "I see you. I know you're here. This is our street, and we're both part of it." A young woman hanging laundry in her front yard would pause mid-reach and offer that small lift of the wrist to every car that passed. A man edging his sidewalk would stop his work and nod. Even children playing in the grass would look up and wave because they'd seen the grown-ups do it and understood, without being told, that this was what you did. It took half a second. It cost nothing. And it was the first thread in the fabric of what made a neighborhood a neighborhood. Today we drive past our own neighbors without looking up. We're on our phones. We're thinking about something else. The wave has become so rare that when it happens, it feels almost surprising. But in 1955, it was as automatic as breathing. There was a code about lawns in 1955, and every household understood it. Your lawn was not just your lawn. It was part of the block, and the block had a standard. A pretty young woman pushing a reel mower down the sidewalk edge on a Saturday morning wasn't doing it just because she felt like it. She was doing it because that's what you did. because the Hendersons next door kept a perfect yard, and the Kowalskis on the other side did too, and your piece of that block was your contribution to something larger than yourself. If someone fell ill and couldn't mow, a neighbor mowed it for them, without being asked, without expecting anything in return, simply because a neglected lawn was a visible sign that something was wrong, and when something was wrong, you helped. If a new family moved in and let things slide, someone would find a way to say something. Usually it was one of the older men on the block, the kind who had a gift for delivering a message so gently you weren't quite sure if you'd just been complimented or corrected. He'd wander over, hands in his pockets, make a little conversation, and somewhere in the middle of it, the point would land. No confrontation, no awkwardness, just a quiet understanding passed from one neighbor to another, and by Saturday, the lawn would be done. No judgment, no hard feelings, just the neighborhood maintaining its standards because everyone agreed, without ever discussing it, that those standards mattered.
This one will sound almost unbelievable to modern ears. In 1955, every child on the block was everyone's responsibility. If a child was misbehaving 2 houses down, any adult who saw it could and would correct them on the spot. A firm word, a look, sometimes a hand on the shoulder, and a very clear instruction about what was and wasn't acceptable on this street. And the child knew better than to argue. The beautiful young woman at the end of the block, who everyone called Miss Eleanor, wasn't anyone's mother, but she'd raised every child on that street as surely as their own parents had, simply by holding them to a standard whenever she saw them. And here's the part that made the whole system work. When that same child got home, their parents already knew.
Because Miss Eleanor, or Mr. Kowalski, or whoever it was, would stroll by at some point and mention it, pleasantly, matter-of-factly, just keeping everyone informed. That child would then be in trouble twice, but they'd also grow up knowing that the world was watching, that there were expectations, that being part of a neighborhood meant being accountable to it, not just to your own front door.
There was no hesitation about this one. A new baby, a death in the family, a sickness that laid someone low for a week, an accident, a surgery, even just a hard stretch, a husband out of work, a wife overwhelmed, a family going through something that didn't have a name. You brought food, a casserole dish wrapped in a kitchen towel, a pie still warm from the oven, a pot of soup left on the porch with a note. You didn't wait to be asked. You didn't check to see if someone else was already handling it. You simply appeared at the door, something hot in your hands, and you said, "We're thinking of you." A lovely young woman in her 20s who just had her first child would find her doorstep covered in food for 2 weeks. Meals she didn't have to think about or plan for during the most exhausting stretch of her life.
An elderly man who'd lost his wife would have neighbors rotating through his kitchen for months, making sure he ate, making sure he wasn't alone, making sure that grief didn't take him too. Nobody kept score. Nobody expected to be repaid. The understanding was simply that someday something would happen to you too, and when it did, the street would show up. That's not charity, that's community. In 1955, noise was a shared resource, and you didn't abuse it. Music was welcome. Parties were welcome. Laughter carrying across the yard on a summer evening was not just acceptable, but part of what made the neighborhood alive. There was a young woman who had a record player and who could be heard from 3 houses away on a warm Friday night, and nobody minded, because it stopped at a decent hour, and the music was good, and she'd been known to invite the whole block when the weather was nice. But there was an understanding about when sound became intrusion, when it stopped being the neighborhood alive and started being the neighborhood inconsiderate. Nobody had to say exactly when that hour was. Everybody knew. And if someone forgot, if a party ran longer than it should, if music drifted toward midnight, someone would come to the door, friendly, apologetic even for the interruption, and they'd say, "It's getting a little late." And that was the end of it. No hard feelings, no calls to authorities, just neighbors calibrating the shared space of a summer night the way civilized people had always done it. If you passed someone on the sidewalk, anyone, stranger or neighbor, you acknowledged them. A nod, a good morning, a brief exchange about the weather or the garden or how the children were doing. A young woman walking to the bus stop in the morning would stop and exchange pleasantries with every neighbor she passed, not because she had time to spare, not because she was particularly social, but because to walk past a person without acknowledging them was understood as something close to an insult. You were on their street, in their neighborhood, moving through the space that they too move through every day. The minimum courtesy was to see them, not to perform some elaborate greeting, not to stop and talk for 20 minutes, just to lift your eyes from the sidewalk and let them know, "I see you. You exist. You are a person, and I am a person, and we share this street." That cost nothing, and it gave something that is increasingly hard to find.
We're just getting started, and I'll tell you right now, the ones coming up are the ones that are going to hit hardest. Because the first 5 rules we've covered are about behavior, about the small, daily things that kept a neighborhood running. But the ones ahead, they're about something deeper than that. They're about trust, about what people owed each other simply by virtue of living side by side. And if something is already coming back to you, a street, a neighbor, a particular summer evening that felt like it could last forever, drop it in the comments. I want to know where you grew up. I want to know what your block was like. Those comments are the best part of what we do here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Every week we go back to a piece of America that most people have forgotten. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button and stay with us. Now, let's keep going. We've got 15 more, and they only get better.
A fence in 1955 was a statement. Not a statement of hostility or privacy. Those things existed, but they were understood differently. A fence was a statement of maintenance, of intention, of belonging to a street that had standards. If you had a fence, you kept it. You painted it when it needed painting. You replaced the boards that rotted or broke. You made sure the gate hung straight. A beautiful stretch of white picket fence along the front of the yard, freshly painted, the gate latch working properly, the posts level. This was a point of neighborhood pride. The woman who kept that fence was keeping something for all of them. A fence that leaned, that weathered, that fell apart and was left that way. This was a different kind of statement, and the neighborhood read it clearly. Someone would help if help was needed. Someone would offer to split the cost of materials or donate a Saturday afternoon with tools. But the fence would be dealt with, one way or another, because the street was watching. This rule had no exceptions. If you borrowed something from a neighbor, a tool, a dish, a folding chair, a ladder, a cup of flour, you returned it, promptly. and you returned it in better condition than you received it. A young woman who borrowed her neighbor's good cake pan returned it scrubbed clean and accompanied by a small portion of whatever she'd made in it. Not because anyone expected that, just because that was how you demonstrated that the trust was warranted. A man who borrowed a neighbor's handsaw returned it with the blade oiled and a quiet word of thanks. What made this rule work wasn't the returning. It was the understanding behind it, that borrowing was an act of trust, and trust required demonstration. Every time you returned something properly, you were making a small deposit into the account of community goodwill. And that account paid dividends in ways you couldn't predict and couldn't plan for.
Whatever happened inside a house stayed inside the house. Marriages had difficulty. Families argued. Children disobeyed, and parents lost patience. None of this was unique to any particular family, and everyone on the street understood that. But it stayed inside. A couple having a disagreement did not take it onto the porch. Voices were kept low. Doors were closed. The street was not the venue for domestic theater. This wasn't about pretending that everything was perfect. It wasn't about shame or silence or pretending that difficulty didn't exist. It was about respect. About the understanding that the neighborhood was a shared space, and that space had to be maintained as a place of a certain quality. A place where a young woman could sit on her porch in the evening without hearing her neighbor's private pain. A place where children could play without absorbing the anxiety of adult conflict. What happened behind the door was private. The street was public, and that line was honored. When a new family moved in, the neighborhood moved. Not the whole street descending at once. That would be overwhelming. But within the first few days, doors would open and neighbors would appear, one by one, with food and introductions and the kind of practical information that made settling in easier. A young woman from 2 houses down might appear with a pie and a list, the best grocery, the name of the good doctor, which bus went downtown, which children on the block were good playmates for which ages. An older man might stop to introduce himself and mention, casually, that the basement floods when it rains hard, and the previous owners had dealt with it this way. This welcome wasn't nosy. It wasn't intrusive. It was the neighborhood extending its hand and saying, "You're part of this now. We're glad you're here, and here's what you need to know to belong." Because belonging required information, and information was freely given.
This rule was never stated anywhere. It didn't need to be. The strip of street in front of a house was understood, implicitly, as belonging to that house. Not legally. The street was public, and everyone knew it. But in practice, in the unwritten code of the neighborhood, you parked in front of your own house. If guests came and filled the available space, that was fine. If you needed to park elsewhere occasionally, that was fine too. But to habitually, regularly, without acknowledgement or apology, park your car in front of someone else's home, to make their view, their access, their curb your default convenience, was a violation of the code. Not a serious one, not one that anyone would confront directly at first, but one that would be noticed and quietly noted, and eventually, in the way of the neighborhood, addressed.
In 1955, the inside of a house was not a destination for healthy children during good weather. You went outside. You stayed outside. You came in when you were called for meals and when the streetlights came on. Everything else happened in the yard, on the sidewalk, in the lot at the end of the block, in the alley, in the creek, in the woods, wherever the neighborhood provided, which was everywhere. The mothers understood this. A young woman with 3 children under 10 years old would send them out the door after breakfast and not see them again until noon, when she'd call from the porch and they'd appear, dirty, for a sandwich and then out again. This was not neglect. This was the neighborhood doing what it was designed to do, providing a safe, contained, supervised, in its collective way, environment for children to become people. The neighborhood was the babysitter. The neighborhood was the playground. The neighborhood was the teacher of everything that couldn't be learned inside four walls. This was one of those rules that operated more through social pressure than through any direct communication. Christmas decorations stayed up through the new year, maybe through January in the colder climates, where getting onto the roof in winter was a genuine hardship. But by February, they came down. A house still decorated in March was a house that was behind. A house that had let something slide. And while nobody would say anything directly, the rest of the neighborhood would feel it as a kind of visual imposition, a lingering obligation to observe something that was over. The young woman on the corner who had the most elaborate display on the block also had the most reliable schedule for putting it up and taking it down. And that reliability was part of what made the display an act of community rather than an act of self-expression at the neighborhood's expense. The cycle of seasons was observed. The street changed with the calendar, and everyone participated in the rhythm. If it snowed, you shoveled. Not eventually. Not when you got around to it. Before people needed to walk. Before the morning school run. Before the elderly woman 2 doors down needed to get to her appointment. You shoveled. And in summer, you kept the crack between your sidewalk and your property clear of weeds. You swept the leaves that gathered in fall. You made sure the concrete was safe, that nothing heaved too badly, that nothing was cracked to the point of being dangerous. The sidewalk in front of your house was your section of the community's infrastructure. It connected your neighbors to their destinations. It connected the street to itself.
Maintaining it was not a favor to your neighbors. It was a responsibility to the community of which you were a member. And in 1955, that responsibility was taken seriously, because everyone understood what a neighborhood was. It was a place held together by exactly these small obligations, honored by everyone, every day, without complaint.
In 1955, houses were close together, and walls were thin, and sound carried through screens and open windows on summer nights. You heard things. A couple arguing, a family struggling with money, a child being disciplined, a piece of news, good or bad, that was meant for those 4 walls and not for the wider street. And what you heard, you kept. Not because it wasn't interesting, not because the neighborhood didn't talk. It did, the way any collection of humans living close together will always talk. But there was a line between the general social currency of neighborhood life and the private pain of individual families. And crossing that line was understood to be a serious breach. A young woman who let slip something she'd overheard through a window would find herself on the wrong side of a line that was very difficult to come back from. Not through any confrontation, not through any official sanction, simply through the gradual withdrawal of trust that such violations always produced. What you heard through walls, you kept. It was not yours to share. We're in the home stretch now. 10 rules down, and we still have the best ones ahead of us. Because everything we've talked about so far, the lawns, the sidewalks, the borrowed tools, the Sunday mornings, all of that was the surface, the visible part. What's coming next goes deeper. These are the rules that weren't about what you did. They were about who you were, about the kind of neighbor, the kind of person, the kind of community member that 1955 America expected you to be. If you're enjoying this walk back in time, do me a favor. Subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the bell so you never miss one of these. We do this every single week, and the next one is already in the works. 10 more rules. Let's finish this together. If your garden produced more than your family could eat, and in 1955 most gardens did, you gave the rest away. Tomatoes in August, zucchini in July, apples in the fall, green beans and cucumbers and whatever else the season provided in surplus. A young woman with a kitchen garden that had gotten away from her, the way kitchen gardens do in a good year, would appear at her neighbor's door with a basket and a smile. Here, take what you can use. And the neighbor would take it gratefully and return the basket washed, and probably fill it with something else before sending it back. This was not about charity. Nobody needed charity from a basket of tomatoes. This was about the abundance of a community being distributed through the community.
About the understanding that what any one household produced was, in some sense, available to all of them. The garden was a kind of common ground, not legally, not even explicitly, but in the quiet economy of neighborhood exchange, the surplus of one household became the enrichment of several. That economy is almost entirely gone now, and something went with it.
Sunday morning had a quality in 1955 that was different from any other time of the week. It was the quietest time, the most deliberately unhurried. The time when the neighborhood collectively agreed, without discussion, to move slowly and make as little noise as possible for a few hours. Power tools were not used Sunday morning. Lawnmowers stayed in the shed until afternoon. Radios were kept low. Voices were moderated. A young woman in her Sunday dress walking to church would pass a street that had slowed itself down for her, for everyone, for the simple idea that one morning a week might be protected from the full noise of ordinary life.
Whether you went to church or not was your own business. But the Sunday morning peace was observed by everyone, because it was understood to belong to everyone. It was, in a way, the neighborhood's gift to itself. One morning a week, when the machinery of ordinary life paused, and you could hear the birds, and your neighbor's screen door, and the distant sound of bells. When something hard happened, and hard things always happened in every house on every street, the neighborhood showed up. Not with solutions, not with opinions about what should have been done differently or what ought to be done now, simply with presence. You came and sat. You held a hand. You made coffee and let it be drunk in silence if silence was what was needed. You brought your body to the place where someone was suffering, and you let them know, without words if words were insufficient, that they were not alone. A young woman whose husband had been in an accident would find the women of the street rotating through her kitchen for days, not cleaning, not reorganizing, not doing anything that hadn't been asked for, just being there. Just being close enough that she could call out if she needed something. This is such a simple thing, and it is one of the hardest things to replicate in an age of digital condolence. A text message is not presence. A phone call is not presence. Presence is a body, in a room, willing to sit in difficulty without flinching. That was what the neighborhood gave, and it was exactly what was needed.
This one operated on every block, in every town, in every corner of America. A young woman walking alone was safe, not because the world was without danger, but because the neighborhood enforced a standard of behavior in public space that made her safe on her own street. Men tipped their hats. They stepped aside on sidewalks. They did not stare or call out or make the public space feel like something to be navigated rather than simply inhabited. If someone violated that standard, and violations happened because people are people, the neighborhood itself would respond. Not with violence, not necessarily with any formal action, but with the weight of collective disapproval that makes a community's standards real. The young woman who lived at the end of the block and walked to work every morning did so without fear. Not because nothing bad ever happened, but because the street she walked was hers as much as anyone's, and everyone on it knew that and behaved accordingly. That standard has not disappeared entirely, but it is no longer enforced by the neighborhood, because the neighborhood no longer exists in the same way. And the loss of that enforcement is felt most by those who needed it most.
In 1955, a stranger walking slowly down a residential street would be noticed, acknowledged, gently, without hostility, but unmistakably. Someone would find a reason to be outside, to offer a nod, to make it clear without saying anything threatening that this street was attended, that the people who lived here were paying attention, that someone unknown in this space would not go unnoticed. This was not paranoia. It was not unfriendliness toward outsiders. Most strangers had perfectly legitimate reasons to be where they were, and the acknowledgement they received would have confirmed that welcome. But a stranger with bad intentions would have found something very different from an opportunity in a 1955 neighborhood. They would have found a community that was awake and watching, a street where everyone knew everyone, and where someone unknown stood out immediately. The neighborhood was its own security system, not because anyone was on guard duty, but because everyone was present, and attention was the natural byproduct of presence. The safety of children on the block was not the responsibility of any one household. It was the collective responsibility of all of them. The man who sat on his porch every afternoon was not just passing time. He was watching, and everyone knew he was watching, including the children, and including anyone else who might consider the presence of unsupervised children an opportunity. The young woman who always seemed to be gardening in her front yard during the afternoon hours, when the school day ended and the children came flooding onto the street, was not coincidentally there. She was there because that was when the children were there, and her presence was a form of protection that required no announcement and cost her nothing she wasn't already doing. The neighborhood produced safety the way a well-tended garden produces food, not through any single heroic act, but through the consistent, unremarkable,
collective attention of everyone involved. Children grew up in that safety and became adults who provided it in turn. The cycle required no instruction because it was taught simply by being lived.
This is a harder one to explain because it seems like a contradiction. The neighborhood was deeply communal. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone was involved in the life of the street. And yet, privacy was held sacred. When you needed to be left alone, truly left alone, for whatever reason that was yours and nobody else's business, the neighborhood gave you that. The curtains drawn in the middle of the day were respected. The family that didn't come out for a few days would be checked on, gently, with a knock and a simple offer, easily refused, but not pushed. You were part of the community. That didn't mean the community owned you. A young woman who needed a day without knocks at the door could have one. The street understood without being told. And when she appeared again, she was welcomed back without comment or inquiry. This balance, presence without intrusion, community without surveillance, is perhaps the most sophisticated thing a neighborhood can achieve. And 1955 America achieved it almost everywhere, almost without trying, because the culture had internalized it so deeply that it operated without instruction.
In 1955, a house was not just yours. It was part of the street's appearance, part of the neighborhood's identity, part of what everyone who lived there presented to the world every single day when they stepped outside. A well-kept home was a contribution to something larger than itself. The painted shutters, the swept porch, the front garden that showed someone cared. These were not just personal choices. They were statements about the kind of street this was and the kind of people who lived on it. A young woman who spent Saturday mornings on her porch with a broom and a bucket was not just cleaning her own space. She was maintaining something shared. And her neighbors, walking past with their morning coffee, understood this and were grateful for it, even if they never said so.
The opposite was also true. A house in visible decline, peeling paint, broken steps, a yard gone to weeds, was not just an eyesore, it was a message. And the neighborhood read that message and, if possible, responded to it, not with judgment, but with help. Because the health of any one house on the block was the concern of everyone on the block.
All of them. Not just the family next door, not just the people you happen to like, or the ones who'd become genuine friends. All of them. You knew the family at the end of the block that kept to themselves. You knew the elderly couple in the house with the big oak tree. You knew the young woman who'd just moved in and hadn't quite found her footing yet. You knew the children's names as well as the parents' names. This was not nosiness. This was the basic minimum of what it meant to live on a street with other people. Because you cannot care for someone whose name you don't know. You cannot check on a neighbor in difficulty if you don't know they exist. You cannot build the kind of trust that makes all the other rules work if the people you're trusting are strangers to you.
Knowing your neighbor's name was the foundation. Everything else was built on it. And in neighborhood after neighborhood, city after city, suburb after suburb, we have lost this foundation. We live within feet of people we have never spoken to and whose names we could not tell you. That loss is not small. It is not incidental. It is the thing underneath everything else.
And here we are. Number 1. It isn't about noise or lawns or borrowing or waving. It isn't about any specific behavior. It's about something that underlies all of them. In 1955, you were accountable to your neighborhood, not to an authority, not to a government, not to a homeowners association with bylaws and fines and enforcement mechanisms, to the actual human beings who lived on your street, whose eyes you met every day, whose lives were woven through yours in 100 small ways. You behaved a certain way because they were watching, not with suspicion, not with hostility, but with the natural attention of people who lived together in a shared space and cared about the quality of that space. A young woman walking out her front door in 1955 walked out into a community that knew her, that would notice if something was wrong, that would help if she needed it.
That would hold her to account if she fell short of the standard, and would support her without reservation if she was doing her best. That accountability, that mutual visibility, that web of small obligations and small kindnesses held together by nothing more than proximity and care, was the infrastructure of the neighborhood. It didn't require technology. It didn't require formal organization. It didn't require anyone to be especially virtuous or selfless or noble. It just required people to be present, to pay attention, to understand that they were part of something larger than their own four walls. We stopped being present. We closed our doors and drew our blinds and got into our cars in our attached garages and drove to places where nobody knew our names. And we told ourselves that this was privacy, that this was freedom, that this was what we wanted. And maybe it was, for a while. But something went with it. Something that you can see in the eyes of anyone who grew up before it was gone. A kind of ease, a kind of safety. The deep cellular knowledge that you were known and watched over, and that if something happened, the street would come. That is what the unwritten rules protected, and that is what we lost when we stopped following them. 25 rules. 25 small pieces of something that held American neighborhoods together for decades. None of them were written down. None of them required enforcement. They just lived in the understanding of the people who shared those streets, passed down by example and by the simple fact of being observed, day after day, by the children who would one day carry them forward. Or not carry them forward, as it turned out. If any of these took you back, if any of them made you think of a street, a neighbor, a morning, a moment, I want to hear about it. Leave me a comment. Tell me which rule your neighborhood lived by that I didn't mention. Tell me the name of the street. Tell me what it was like. Those stories are why this channel exists, and I read every single one. If you believe some things are worth remembering, subscribe. We'll keep doing this together. One rule, one memory, one piece of American life at a time. Until next time, take care of yourself, and don't forget where you came from.